These are the 18 positions in America's presidential succession. Vice President. The Vice President of the United States presides over the Senate and assumes the presidency if the President is unable to perform their duties. This is the only succession position where the transfer of power is permanent rather than temporary. The Vice President casts tie-breaking votes in the Senate and receives written declarations under the 25th Amendment regarding presidential inability. When the presidency becomes vacant, the Vice President automatically becomes President, not acting President. Gerald Ford became President on August 9, 1974, following Richard Nixon's resignation. Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency on November 22, 1963, after John Kennedy's assassination. Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the United States. House of Representatives is second in the presidential line of succession. This position leads the House as its presiding officer and sets the legislative agenda for the majority party. Unlike the Vice President, who assumes the presidency automatically, the Speaker must resign both as Speaker and as representative to assume the presidency. This makes it the only succession position requiring resignation from current office before taking power. The Speaker also receives presidential disability declarations under the 25th Amendment. This position was restored to the succession line by the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. President Pro Tempore of the Senate. The President Pro Tempore of the United States Senate is third in the presidential line of succession. This senator presides over the Senate when the Vice President is absent and administers oaths required by the Constitution. By Senate tradition, this position goes to the senator of the majority party with the longest continuous service. Chuck Grassley of Iowa assumed the office on January 3, 2025, for his second time in this role. The President Pro Tempore is one of few members of Congress entitled to a full-time security detail due to their succession position. Secretary of State. The Secretary of State represents the United States to foreign countries and manages American foreign policy. This is the fourth position in the succession line and the first cabinet member. Where the congressional positions focus on domestic governance, the Secretary of State directs America's relationships with every nation on earth. The Secretary advises the President on foreign policy and diplomatic appointments, supervises the Foreign Service and immigration policy, and conducts negotiations and interprets treaties. The Department of State also provides passport services to citizens and ensures protection of Americans and their interests abroad. Marco Rubio was nominated as Secretary of State in January 2025 for the Trump administration. Secretary of the Treasury. The Secretary of the Treasury is the principal advisor to the President on economic and fiscal policy and manages all federal finances. This position is fifth in the succession line. The Secretary formulates and recommends domestic and international financial, economic, and tax policy, manages the public debt, and combats economic threats to national security. The Department of the Treasury is the oldest executive department, established on September 2, 1789. Scott Bessent was sworn in as the 79th Secretary of the Treasury on January 28, 2025. Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense is the head of the Department of Defense and principal defense policy advisor to the President. This position is sixth in succession and second only to the President in the military chain of command. The Secretary exercises command and control over all military branches including the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Space Force. The operational chain of command runs from the President to the Secretary to the commanders of the combatant commands. The position was created by the National Security Act of 1947 to unify military command after World Wars I and II. Attorney General. The Attorney General is the head of the Department of Justice and the chief law enforcement officer of the federal government. This position is seventh in succession. While the Secretary of Defense commands military forces abroad, the Attorney General enforces federal law within American borders. The Attorney General represents the United States in legal matters and supervises all components of the Justice Department, including the FBI, DEA, ATF, and Bureau of Prisons. The office furnishes legal advice to the President and Cabinet and recommends federal judicial appointments. The office of the Attorney General was created in 1789 as a one-person, part-time position. Congress created the Department of Justice in June 1870, drastically expanding the Attorney General's responsibilities. Secretary of the Interior. The Secretary of the Interior manages and conserves federal lands, natural resources, and implements environmental protection. This position is eighth in succession. The Secretary oversees 480 million acres of federal public lands, which is 75% of all federal land. The department manages the National Park Service, implements trust responsibilities to Native American communities, and regulates energy, water, and mining on federal lands. The Department of the Interior was created on March 3, 1849, to administer lands acquired through the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican War, and the 1846 treaty with Great Britain. Secretary of Agriculture. The Secretary of Agriculture provides leadership on food, agriculture, natural resources, rural development, and nutrition. This position is ninth in succession. The Secretary executes federal laws on food, farming, forestry, and rural development, ensures food safety, and oversees nutrition programs, including food stamps and school lunch. President Abraham Lincoln established the Department of Agriculture on May 15, 1862, calling it the People's Department. The position was elevated to cabinet level in 1889. USDA nutrition programs serve over 40 million Americans through SNAP. At this point in the succession line, the scale of federal responsibility becomes striking. The first 8 positions span from constitutional offices to departments managing war, justice, land, and food. The remaining 10 cabinet secretaries each control a distinct aspect of American life. Secretary of Commerce. The Secretary of Commerce promotes American businesses, trade, and economic growth. This position is 10th in succession. The Secretary advises the President on commerce matters, promotes exports and international trade, and enforces trade agreements and sanctions. The Department of Commerce oversees 13 bureaus with diverse functions, including conducting the census, managing weather, forecasting through NOAA, setting industrial and technology standards, and allocating radio frequency spectrum. The department was established as a distinct entity in 1913 when it split from the Department of Commerce and Labor. Secretary of Labor. The Secretary of Labor fosters and promotes the welfare of wage earners, job seekers, and retirees. This position is 11th in succession. Where Commerce promotes business interests, Labor protects workers. The Secretary enforces federal labor laws, oversees workplace safety through OSHA, protects workers' rights and wages, and administers unemployment insurance programs. The Department of Labor enforces more than 180 federal laws and thousands of federal regulations, covering about 10 million employers and 125 million workers. William Wilson became the first Secretary of Labor when the cabinet-level department was created on March 4, 1913. Secretary of Health and Human Services. The Secretary of Health and Human Services advises the President on health policy and manages programs protecting Americans' health and well-being. This position is 12th in succession. The Secretary administers Medicare and Medicaid programs, oversees Affordable Care Act implementation, and leads federal public health emergency responses. The Secretary controls the FDA drug approval process and directs the CDC, NIH, and CMS. The department was created as Health, Education, and Welfare on April 11, 1953, and renamed Health and Human Services on October 17, 1979, when education became a separate department. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development increases affordable housing and promotes community development. This position is 13th in succession. The Secretary advises the President on housing and urban development, maintains public housing, and provides mortgage insurance for real estate. The department focuses on the low-income housing market, which commercial lenders often overlook. President Lyndon Johnson established the department on September 9, 1965, as part of his Great Society program. The FHA insures mortgages, enabling homeownership for millions who couldn't qualify for conventional loans. Secretary of Transportation. The Secretary of Transportation delivers a safe, efficient, sustainable, and equitable national transportation system. This position is 14th in succession. The Secretary advises the President on transportation policy and oversees 13 transportation agencies, including the FAA, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Railroad Administration, and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The department coordinates all transportation modes, including air, road, rail, maritime, and pipeline. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Department of Transportation Act on October 15, 1966, and the department launched on April 1, 1967. Secretary of Energy. The Secretary of Energy advises the President on energy policy and oversees the United States nuclear weapons arsenal. This position is 15th in succession. Unlike the Secretary of Defense, who commands conventional military forces, the Secretary of Energy controls America's nuclear weapons. The Secretary manages nuclear weapons production, maintenance, and disposal through the National Nuclear Security Administration. The NNSA maintains all 3,700 nuclear warheads in the arsenal and dismantles retired weapons. The department also promotes renewable energy and energy efficiency research. President Jimmy Carter created the department on October 1, 1977, by merging the Atomic Energy Commission and the Energy Research and Development Administration. Secretary of Education. The Secretary of Education is the principal advisor to the President on federal education policies and programs. This position is 16th in succession. The Secretary establishes federal financial aid policies, distributes and monitors education funds, and enforces civil rights laws in education. The department does not operate schools, but provides funding and ensures compliance with federal law. The department manages a $228 billion budget and enforces the Every Student Succeeds Act. Federal Pell Grants provide need-based aid to over 6 million low-income college students annually. The modern Department of Education was established in 1980 when it split from Health, Education, and Welfare. Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs provides health, education, disability, and financial benefits to military veterans. This position is 17th in succession, second to last. The Secretary oversees the VA healthcare system, administers disability compensation, provides education assistance through the GI Bill, and manages VA home loan programs. The department also oversees 135 national veteran cemeteries, providing burial and memorial benefits. President Herbert Hoover created the Veterans Administration on July 21, 1930. President Ronald Reagan elevated it to cabinet-level status in 1989, with Edward Derwinski becoming the first secretary. Secretary of Homeland Security. The Secretary of Homeland Security ensures the safety and security of the nation from terrorism, natural disasters, and other emergencies. This position is 18th and last in the succession line. The Secretary manages counterterrorism operations, border security and immigration enforcement, transportation security through TSA, and disaster response through FEMA. The department merged 22 existing federal agencies and is the third largest cabinet department with over 240,000 employees. President George W. Bush signed the Homeland Security Act on November 25, 2002, 11 days after the September 11th attacks. The department became operational on March 1, 2003, marking the largest government reorganization in 50 years. This newest cabinet position represents how the succession line adapts to protect the presidency through every era of American history. Thanks for watching. Now that you know all 18 positions in the succession line, which do you think is most critical to national security? Let me know in the comments. Also, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed.